One thing that sits in common across many cultures is the idea of identity. That how you perceive yourself in relation to others is one of the most important things about you. It's the thing that looks for an answer to questions like, who am I? And who am I in relation to others? And the idea of identity is centrally important to the Christian faith as well. But there are differences between cultures in how we come to develop a sense of identity. Think of the culture that we're part of here in Sydney. To some degree, we take our sense of who we are from others, which is seen in questions that we ask people when we first meet them. Where do you live? What school did you go to? What do you do? Our perception of someone is determined by where they live or where they studied or their chosen profession. But we're told in our culture that more important than what other people think is what we think of ourselves. Our culture says that who we are is found within us, and we can choose our own identity based on how we feel about ourselves and how we perceive ourselves, which is why a central issue in our society is developing self-esteem, so that even if other people won't choose you, I can learn to choose myself. In Corinthian culture, on the other hand, who I am is based on how others see me. So if I want a secure view of myself, I need to work to make myself look important. And this is done through self-promotion, puffing myself up to look big, boasting of my abilities and achievements in order for others to see me in this way. Although you also need in Corinthian culture to make sure you do this in a way that looks right, unless you seem too self-important. The Roman historian Plutarch wrote a book to help people with this called How a Man May Inoffensively Praise Himself Without Being Liable to Envy. My sense of identity in Corinthian culture comes from how I look and who I'm associated with, and what I have a means of making myself look better. Plutarch said of Roman society that most men think themselves robbed of their wealth if they are prevented from displaying it. This perception of being wealthy and powerful and important is crucial because my identity is based on what other people think of me. But if you look at Paul and think of Christian identity, it's distinct from either of these two. It's neither based on how I feel or perceive myself to be, nor is it based on how I am perceived by others, but it's based on who I am in reference to God. And this is what Paul shows us in this passage. And he begins by speaking about how the Corinthians should think of him. This is how one should regard us, he says, as apostles, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. Paul is saying this is how you should see my role among you, as a servant of Christ. Notice it's in reference to Christ. As a steward of God's mysteries, the faithful household manager who administers the requirements of the master. He's saying, God has entrusted me to be a manager of those he's placed under my care. So don't put me on a pedestal, but see me as a servant and as a manager who will be held to account according to my faithfulness and trustworthiness. Some people take Paul's words here to presume that the success or failure of a servant of Christ is seen in their faithfulness. If we faithfully preach the gospel, some people will say, that is all we need to do. But I think that's misguided. Faithfulness is certainly part of the picture here, and trustworthiness is essential. But the real measure of success for Paul, I think, is whether those under his care grow up into maturity in Christ. That's why he's writing this letter. But Paul says he doesn't want to judge prematurely whether he's faithfully done this or not. He recognizes that people will inevitably judge how he's doing, but he is not too concerned about what they think. He says, but with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. What people think of me and how they respond to me, well, that's not that important to me. This isn't a matter for Paul of being a narcissist, I don't think, or having a heart of stone where he's not affected because he won't listen to people's critique. But it's about being able to hold what people think and say in perspective and not attaching what they think to who I am. And in saying this, he shows the Corinthians that he's approaching his understanding to himself in a very different way to how they approach their own identity. And then he goes a step further and he says, not only does he not regard others' perceptions too highly, but he doesn't even trust his own opinion of himself either. He says, in fact, I do not even judge myself, for I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. He says, look, I don't even trust myself as a good judge. It's not that I'm not self-reflecting, but just because I don't see anything I'm doing wrong doesn't mean that I'm not deceiving myself. I'm not thereby acquitted. That word is to be pronounced righteous or justified. He says, no, that's God's business to pronounce me righteous or to justify me. It is the Lord who judges me, he says. Therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God. What Paul shows here is that his understanding of his role in the church and his identity as a person are distinct, although connected. And the way that they're connected is important. The role he plays don't make him who he is, like building blocks to form his identity. But the roles he plays flow out of his identity, more like a river from its source, as an expression of who he is. And he says to the Corinthians, you should do the same as I do. He says, I have applied all these things to myself and the apostles for your benefit, brothers, that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up in favor of one against another. I want you to learn from me, he's saying, so you're not competing with one another in order to look big, to find a secure sense of self. For who sees anything different in you? What do you have that you did not receive? If you received it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? Paul sees what he has as a gift from God. Who he is a gift. What God has called him to do is a gift. It's not something he's earned or proved himself worthy of or needs to prove himself to anyone else to do. And so what he does or what others think of what he does doesn't shape his identity. And then he contrasts his approach with the Corinthian approach to highlight how drastically different they are and why their approach doesn't work. For the Corinthians, identity comes from what they have and how they look and who they're associated with. Their view of themselves is based on what others think of them. And so Paul gives this fiercely sarcastic contrast between the Corinthian view of themselves and the actual lives of the apostles. He says, on the one hand, there's you Corinthians. Already, you have all you want. Already, you've become rich. Without us, you've become kings. And here's sarcasm here. And would that you did reign, so that we might share the rule with you. Here he talks about what the Corinthians value, where they get their identity from, having all they want, having riches, being seen as kings. And Paul points out a wonderful irony here. The irony for the Corinthians is that they are putting people like Paul and Apollos and Peter on a pedestal and associating themselves with them in order to look good. But in fact, according to a Corinthian definition of success, these men are actually losers. Compare the Corinthians' view of themselves as kings for being associated with the apostles with the reality of the apostles themselves. For I think that God has exhibited us apostles as last of all, like men sentenced to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, to angels and to men. Paul uses a well-known image here of an emperor who, having conquered a land, leaves those he has defeated behind him in utter shame and humiliation through the centre of town in a kind of ticker tape parade toward their public execution at the Colosseum, as a spectacle for everyone to watch, which celebrates the might and the power of the conqueror of Rome. Paul offers this picture, saying to them effectively, so explain to me how this works. You're at the front of the victory parade as if you're the one that's conquered. And we are the captives at the rear, being led to the Colosseum for your entertainment as we die. And yet you're boasting about being associated with us because you think it'll give you good street cred. Guys, the picture doesn't work. He says, we are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are held in honor, but we in disrepute. He's saying, you can see that your perception of yourselves is in vast contrast to my reality, and my reality is shameful for you. To the present hour, we hunger and thirst. That's shameful because we have to ask for help. We are poorly dressed. That's shameful because we don't have dignity. And buffeted and homeless. That's shameful but because we look weak and we lack your wealth. And we labour working with our own hands. That's shameful to have to do manual labour like slaves. According to Corinthian values, the apostles should be ashamed of these things. And yet Paul is not ashamed, but boasts in them. He goes on. When reviled, we bless. For those who speak against him rudely, he shows kindness. When persecuted, we endure. When he's misunderstood and treated unfairly, he's got the internal resources and resolve and resilience to persevere without those things devastating him. When slandered, we entreat. In the face of those who speak about him behind his back, Paul appeals to them face to face. We have become and are still like the scum of the world, the refuse of all things. He says they are literally viewed as the dirt scraped off a utensil to put in the bin, or the scraps swept off the floor, or the filth wiped off people's shoes. Gordon Fee says that what's going on here is that the Corinthians think that how they see themselves as wise and rich and powerful is how they think Paul should be too. But Paul is saying that that's all hot air. And the way that he actually is the way that they should be too. You see, to bless and to endure and to entreat isn't seen as weak to us. But in Paul's day, it was weak. Because you're not flexing your muscles and you're not proving yourself as bigger and better than others. But Paul's saying, this is what maturity looks like. This is real power. I don't know if you've ever tried to do those things that Paul says that he does. When you're feeling emotionally affected by what someone's accusing you of. How do you not either A, shoot back at the person with the same venom shot at you, nor just dismiss what they say altogether and write them off? To say it's not easy is an understatement. Paul speaks about these things here as if it's a regular habit of his life, like an automatic response that he has. But I don't think it is. I think that it is something that is practiced and learned. I've heard it told of Billy Graham that when the media spoke critically about him in the paper or on the radio, that he would get in touch with that person who criticised him and ask to meet with them. And when he met with them, he'd asked if it was okay if he took some notes. and he'd listen to their critique. And he'd clarify what they were saying in order to know that he'd heard them correctly. And then what he'd do is he'd take this information away and he'd spend time sitting with it in order to discern if there is truth in what they said. How do you do this? To bless when spoken against, to endure when persecuted, to go to the person when they have slandered you. The only way is if you have learned, and this is something that we will only learn if we intentionally train ourselves in it, I think, if we remember and remind ourselves on it. Firstly, to find security in who I am based on God's judgment, in reference to God, not based on what I feel or what others say. And secondly, to be able to separate what I do, my roles in life, with who I am. Because otherwise, when you give your opinion of me, whether it's invited or not, about how well I am or I'm not doing in my role, I'll take it as personal affirmation or attack on who I am. How do we learn this? I think Paul's answer would be, you join Christian community to learn it. And you're like, yeah, well, at least I'd have plenty of practice there, wouldn't I? Which is precisely the point. Christian community is the perfect place to practice, because in community, you begin to understand your identity as belonging to God's people, his field, his building, his temple, his body. You don't need to prove yourself to these people. These are the people who don't assess you based on how you look or what you have, but they're people who help you to understand our shared identity in Jesus based on God's judgment, and who remind you that what you do flows out of who we are as God's people. Paul doesn't need his job to boost his sense of self. He doesn't need his title of apostle to boost his sense of self. He doesn't need Corinthian status to boost his sense of self. He doesn't need people to like his photos on Instagram to boost his sense of self. And it's only because he doesn't need these things to feel secure that he's able to bless when reviled, persevere when persecuted, move toward people when they speak badly about him. But he's distressed about divisions in the Corinthian community because this affects their shared identity in Christ. Paul wraps up in these final verses, asking the Corinthian church to examine their own approach in light of his. Are they willing to listen to him as a father trying to help their child understand something that's important for them to learn if they're going to discover true power and maturity in their faith? He says, I do not write these things to make you ashamed, but to admonish you as my beloved children. For though you have countless guides in Christ, you do not have many fathers, for I became your father in Christ Jesus through the gospel. I urge you then, be imitators of me. That is why I sent you Timothy, my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ, as I teach them everywhere, in every church. And so I leave you with this question, not as a father, but as a fellow imitator of Paul. Where does your identity lie? And how does being part of God's unified people contribute to your understanding of yourself?